philosophical mysticism, the one and only moral law. So the one and only moral law. There is no ideology, no hidden causes, only competition. And the ethical law opposed to nature is do not exploit. And this is going to be the moral rule, the only moral rule that philosophical mysticism is going to accept. And the way this moral rule is derived is by rebelling against nature, by opposing nature. So nature, exploitation is the norm. So by refusing to exploit, you're going to be doing something opposed to nature. And that's the basis of my moral law. And this is the only moral rule moral beings, human or otherwise, need to follow. And I would even go as far as to say that this ethical law applies to all species in nature, including animals and artifacts and so on. So even animals are subject to the moral law. Of course, and a lot of philosophers won't go here, but I'll say this because animals tend to exploit each other. Most animals are immoral, so there's no escaping the moral law. Because the animals exploit, most animals are going to be immoral. The moral law would also apply to aliens who may choose to be moral. The moral law would also apply to robots who may choose to be moral. And again, animals really don't have a choice, but it doesn't matter. They're subject to the moral law nonetheless. And by exploiting, if the animals exploit whether they choose to or not, they're doing something immoral. Why we should follow the one and only moral law. So again, the one and only moral law is do not exploit. So why follow it? Well, there is only one moral law, and only one moral law is needed. So we really only need one. It does all the work that it needs to do. And so, for example, humans tend to be really bad at following moral rules. So like if you look at like the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, it only has 10 rules, which really aren't that many rules. But most people, including religious people, fail to adhere to these rules. So by only having one moral rule, it's going to lead to greater compliance. When there's only one explicit moral rule, people are more likely to follow it. Also, the one and only moral law is clear. It can be easily followed. It's a pretty clear rule. It's a pretty straightforward rule. Everyone knows what it means to exploit someone. We have an intuitive understanding of what exploitation is. We all know it when we see it. So it's very easy if you are about to exploit someone and you're aware of this, and most people are, just don't do it. So yeah, it's a pretty straightforward moral law or moral rule for us to follow. Why the one and only moral law is good. If followed individually or collectively, the one and only moral law consistently leads to a great amount of well-being and lesser amount of harm. That's just the way it works out. There's reasons for why this is the case, but it tends to consistently lead to a great amount of well-being and lesser amount of harm. Though I will admit, the one and only moral law might not bring about the most amount of well-being in all cases. So for instance, intentionally maximizing the good and minimizing harm, such as like in utilitarianism, might produce more good overall. So the rules of something like utilitarianism or actions of utilitarianism might actually lead to more good overall, Um, I'll admit that. But the one and only moral law tends to produce a pretty good amount of well-being, a pretty good amount of happiness, and definitely is going to reduce suffering or going to reduce harm considerably. So it's not a maximizing theory, and that's okay. It still produces a fairly good amount of well-being. Maybe not the most, but the most possible, but a good amount. So it's not a maximizing theory. Exploitation is taken to be intrinsically bad in itself, independent of well-being and harm. So there's never an option to exploit. Exploitation is always bad. So never ever do it. And I think that makes it easier to follow. The one and only moral law is simple. Again, there are no exceptions. Just don't exploit in all cases. And once you accept and remember the one and only moral law, you never have to think about morality again. It's that simple. Once you remember it, you're done. You're done with morality. That's all you have to do is follow the moral law. Don't exploit. And you never have to think about morality again. And I think that's pretty good. It's a pretty good thing. In its simplicity, it makes it a very good moral rule to follow. The one and only moral law also applies to oneself. So this is important. You should never, or you should not exploit oneself or let yourself be exploited. So you should never ever allow this, or do this to yourself, unless avoiding exploitation will involve exploiting someone else. So that's going to be the limit. And again, intentionally letting oneself be exploited is a very bad thing. It's a very, very bad thing to be exploited. Or intentionally letting yourself be exploited is a very bad thing. But to be very clear, exploiting someone else is worse. So I'm going to follow Socrates here in thinking that it's worse to do injustice than to suffer injustice. And I think Socrates is right here. So not exploiting others is going to have priority. Not exploiting others is going to have priority over not exploiting yourself or letting yourself be exploited. And sometimes to follow the moral law, you have to let yourself be exploited. It's not a great thing. It'd be nice if it was otherwise, but that's just the way it is. Sometimes you have to let yourself be exploited to genuinely follow the one and only moral law. So you got to do it. Hopefully it's not too bad. Hopefully the exploitation isn't too bad and doesn't harm you too much. But also, to be clear, this is not an endorsement of altruism. Again, this is not an endorsement of altruism. You should do everything you can to get out of the exploited situation by whatever means possible and as soon as possible, as long as it doesn't involve exploiting others. So again, if you are being exploited, get out as soon as you can. Use whatever means possible to get out, as long as those means don't involve exploiting others. That's the only limitation here. It's the only limit here. But besides exploiting others, you should do whatever you can to get out of an exploited situation. So that's the one and only moral law. This is the only rule that philosophical mysticism is going to endorse. It's only one more rule in the whole system. And I think it's a good rule. I think it's pretty straightforward. I think it's easy to follow. And I think it will produce a considerable amount of good. If you want to learn more, check out the book Philosophical Mysticism, a spiritual handbook for mankind by Nicholas Schroeder. Definitely worth a read.